Hey, how you doing? This is RJ. Today I'm going to talk a little bit more about storytelling than about comics themselves, although I'm going to certainly include comics in what I am talking about. And what I am going to look at is there a point where a story becomes broken? And I would say yes, indeed there is. There is a story that works and there's a story that doesn't work. And when your story doesn't work, the story has become broken. And I'm going to concentrate on stories that are science fiction fantasy stories, because that's typically what I talk about with comics and sometimes movies and sometimes anime and manga. But what I am going to say, I think, can cover any kind of story, although I'm concentrating on science fiction fantasy. But this is how I started thinking about it and how a story can become broken. I was thinking about science fiction fantasy stories and how they have been used over the years as social commentary. And I would say, to begin with, if you're looking at a story, the difference between a story that works and a story that doesn't work, the breaking point for a story, at least one of the breaking points, one of the major ones, which we will be discussing here with science fiction fantasy, is when your story moves from being social commentary into being propaganda. And that is what is going on today with your comics. And I'll have to define my terms, what I mean by propaganda. And I've used this in a number of videos if you've been around my channel for a while. I don't use the term propaganda in the ancient term of the idea, where it's simply the propagation of an idea. I define it for my discussions in the more narrow way, which has been used since the end of the Second World War. And it being that it's a propagation of an idea in a way that gets around the use of your rational mind. So what it seeks to do, propaganda, is to convince you of an idea in a way that purposefully does not engage your rational mind. And so there are several different ways to do this. One of those ways would be to teach you something simply through emotion. Because emotion does have a logical connection to reason, but most people don't understand that connection. And so when these types of stories sell you an idea purely on emotion, they are doing so in a way which gets around the engagement of your rational mind. Another way of doing this would be to tell you a lie often enough and loud enough so that you are convinced that it is true. Again, this would be a way of convincing you of an idea that gets around your rational mind. And so that's where I would say a story becomes broken, when it moves from social commentary into propaganda. And that's where this discussion is going to end up. But I'll have to take a couple of steps back from there, because if I'm assuming that a story can be broken, there's also an assumption that there is a standard form of a story that it is supposed to follow in order for it to work. And I would say yes, indeed. And this will come as no shock to anyone who's been around my channel for a while. I would say that that standard form goes according to logic. And just to pull in something else than logic itself to look at this, I ran across a study a while ago talking about how human beings are pattern recognizers. And I would say logic is the ultimate pattern recognizer, or at the very least, it is the ultimate pattern recognizer that people can use in their everyday lives. And so when you apply logic to something, you are using it in order to, as the old way of putting it, advance with order and ease in that pattern recognition of what it is you are actually doing at this moment. And it's no different with a story. You need pattern recognition in your story, and you advance in your story with order and ease through logic and tell a good story that way. And I would say that since Aristotle created logic in the roughly 400s BC, there has been a standard of using that logic to apply it to stories, which Aristotle himself did. And that has been the standard for Western stories because it actually works best with how to tell a story. And that's how a story gets told with order and ease and makes the most sense to a human being. So when you look at storytelling in this way, storytelling is a form of rhetoric. And rhetoric is a form of argumentation. And what you're trying to do with your story is to convince your audience of something. And I would say, at the very least, at the absolute minimum, what you're trying to convince your audience of is that what you are presenting to them as an imitation of reality is real enough so that they become engaged in the story itself as if it were real. To put it a different way, your audience will engage their suspension of disbelief so that they can believe in the reading or the watching or the telling of the story that this is actually real, and so they become engaged with the story itself. Because if that's not there, reading a story would be no different than reading, I don't know, a technical manual for your toaster or something of the kind. So if we look at a story as a form of rhetoric, which is a form of argumentation, all argumentation proceeds upon pre-existent knowledge. That's what happens within logic. And logic itself has its own pre-existing knowledge that it bases itself upon. You know, the 3 laws of logic that say things like a thing is what it is, and a thing cannot be and not be at the same time, in the same place, in the same way. Simple things that can be confirmed by demonstration that everybody has access to in their lives, simply by engaging their reason. And so your story needs to proceed upon pre-existent knowledge. Now, there's 2 different kinds of pre-existent knowledge that you can present. One would be showing the universal in the particular, but in terms of a story, I don't think that is the one that is used very much. The one that is used all the time is that you assume the audience accepts your primary premises. And that's what I would say almost all stories are built upon. You have an author and you have an audience. And your author is saying that this is what I accept as my primary background, as my bedrock for what I am going to build my story off of, and your audience is going to accept that as well, just as soon as they begin reading the story. And so there is a setup of, again, a bedrock for your story, out of which you lay down some other premises. And these premises would be suppositions. They would be if-then statements. You know, if this, then that. If people could have superpowers, then the world would look like this. It is this way, and then that proceeds from it. And what proceeds from it needs to be either necessary or possible. That is to say that your if-then statement would follow as either being necessary or being possible. So let's take an example. Let's take Wolverine as an example. You say, if you had a person who had a healing factor which rapidly regenerates any degradation in the body, then that power set would necessarily include the slowing down of aging, because aging is a degradation of the body. Or let's take another X-Men for our example. Let's take, I don't know, Havoc, and say, if you had a person who had almost limitless power within them, then possibly they might not be able to contain it very well. You know, so you have your if-then statements. And the end would need to be either necessary or possible. And the thing is that the understanding of your audience needs to be there so that they can understand where you are at the present moment and trace back through your premises to your bedrock, which you both accept as being true, so that they can engage with the story and understand it. Or, to put it another way, they can know the cause of everything that is going on in your story. And knowing that cause shouldn't be too difficult for them. All they need to do is engage their simple, rational mind and to think about, usually, demonstrations of this happening in their own life in some way. So they have access through demonstration to their own knowledge of this happening in some way, or being at the very least possible, given the set of circumstances which they accept as the bedrock of your story. And I would say, now this is just purely me, but I would say that in constructing these suppositions, these if-then suppositions, to build up your story. You can use a lot of them, but I would say that the more of them that you can place directly on your bedrock of your foundation of accepted knowledge, the better your story is going to be. You could stack some suppositions upon the results of another supposition, but I would say that you could do it for 1, then maybe 2, but if you get into 3, that's pretty shaky territory and you're playing with fire. You don't want to go too far away from your bedrock of your accepted knowledge. I would say 3 maximum. And because, again, as an author, you would need your audience to be able to trace back from the present result of your proposition backwards through the other suppositions so that he can get to the bedrock knowledge and then understand through his own engagement of reason and his acceptance of that original knowledge what is going on with your story. Now, here's a key thing to note. When you're talking about a story built in this way, you are assuming something. You are assuming that your audience anywhere can engage their reason and understand what's going on in the story. And that is a statement that man has a nature, and that nature includes being rational. And that's the old way of looking at human beings, by the way. It was what was declared was the human nature of human beings, every human being, and was accepted as true for the last several millennia up until the last few hundred years, and certainly the last 100 years. It was that man is a rational creature. That was the understanding of the very simplest form of human nature. Man is a rational creature. And so they can engage their reason in order to understand stories in this way. So building stories this way assumes that you have a nature and that it includes being rational. But let's look at current comic stories that are written by quote-unquote progressive individuals. Now, this skeleton of a story that I've just described according to logic, it is the way that a story proceeds best, I would say, and with order and ease. And it is certainly the way in which people in our Western culture expect a story to proceed. So these people who are writing these stories, it doesn't matter that they are progressive-minded people, they are still trying to use that skeletal system to build their own story. But there's several problems when they do that. Not the least of which being that a lot of these people are socialist-minded people. You know, you have people like Jordan White, who is the editor of all of the X-Men books over at Marvel and has been promoted recently. You know, he came out very clearly and said he was a socialist. Or if you look at many of these other storytellers that work for both Marvel and DC, they like to retweet a lot of socialist-minded people, you know, people like Alexandria Cortez or stuff like that. So they are of a similar mindset, if not straight out socialist minded themselves. And the thing is about socialism, it and the political ideology on which it is founded, it proceeds backwards. It proceeds from an idea that mankind can build a utopia, and then they work backwards from that to construct their political ideology. Now, working backwards from an endpoint is certainly not unheard of, nor is it a bad way to flush something out and understand its causes, but the thing is that that endpoint should be an endpoint which is provable or demonstratable as either, again, being either necessary or possible. But their endpoint of the human utopia is not either necessary or necessarily possible. And I personally would say that a quick scan of history would suggest that it is actually impossible. But the thing is that they move backwards from that and say, well, we can build a social utopia. Well, if we can build a social utopia, then how would it be built? And they would say, well, it can be built if we can shape and change society and each of the individuals within the society in order to produce that utopia. And if we can assume that we can change people and the collection of people, which is society, into doing this, then they must be infinitely variable. You must be able to change and shape human beings in an infinite number of ways to produce this. But the only way that you can have a human being that is infinitely variable is if you discount any idea of a human nature at all. Because if you have a fixed point in your human nature, then that is something that won't change. And that's a barrier to being infinitely variable. You can't have both of them at the same time. They're mutually exclusive. So your socialist-minded people have to automatically get rid of any idea that there is a human nature. And it certainly has to get rid of any idea that was held since ancient times that human nature is that human beings are a rational creature. So, since they get rid of this idea of both human nature and that man is by nature rational, then when they try to use this skeletal system for a story, when they go back to what in the logical sense would be the foundational basis of knowledge to construct their story upon and proceed from, well, for them, it's more of a starting point that they pretend to be foundational and is not actually foundational, because their foundational point, in quotation marks, would be their political ideology. And their political ideology, 1, is not based on reason, and 2, cannot be shown to be demonstratable through the understanding of your human being and their typical interaction with each other and reality. So to put all that in a different way, their original basis, which they build their story off of, is in itself a supposition. Again, it's not understood knowledge that both the author and the audience share and accept as being true because it can be easily demonstratable through reality. No, it's that the author and the audience accept it with no foundational bedrock of its own. Or if you want to put it in poetic terms, your original logical story would actually base its story upon foundational bedrock. Whereas these people, in their progressive mindset, they're building the house of their story upon the foundation of a cloud. It's just, all in all, an imaginary idea. Now, there are several ways in which this kind of storytelling expresses itself in the current comic market. And one of the ways which it expresses itself is the notion that this comic is not for you. And we can see why they have this mindset to some degree through looking at this model. Because you have your author, and your author is using his progressive mindset as his quote-unquote foundation from which he builds the rest of his story. And that foundation is his political ideology. So the thing is that if you went to one of these progressive authors and said to them on social media, look, I'm a conservative, but I really like your work, they would say back to you, go away. This story is not for you. And why would they do that? Well, I'm sure this wouldn't be in the forefront of their mind in explaining it, but I would say this would be the process. In their minds, and that's key, in their minds, they think that anyone who does not accept their political ideology does not understand it. There isn't a third option like normal people would have saying, yes, I understand it, I just don't accept it. No, in their minds, if you don't accept it, automatically you don't understand it. And if they're using their political ideology as the quote-unquote foundation from which they build their story, and you don't accept their political ideology, then you don't understand their political ideology, and you won't understand anything else which comes forth in their story because they're using that political ideology to build off of. And since you don't understand either the political ideology or anything that is going to proceed from it in the story, then you're not going to be able to understand the story, and automatically the story is not for you. And this causes massive problems, not the least of which is the fact that when you use that logical model, I would say you should use as the basis of your story, or at the very least include in the basis of your story, human nature itself. And in such a way, your audience could quite possibly be every living human being on the planet. But for these progressive writers, when they are putting their political ideology as the basis for their story, they are restricting their audience to only those people who accept their political ideology. And so that shrinks your audience to a minute number as compared with a traditional way of actually writing a story. But it's not only that. It's also that because their original basis from which they build their story is in itself a supposition, they have no problem building supposition upon supposition upon supposition. Suppose this happened, then that result. Take that then result. Suppose something else happened off of that, then you would get this further result. And so they have no problem building a tower of suppositions, where I would say you can't go more than 2 or 3 without playing with fire. No, these people believe that they can build a tower of suppositions. And further, I would say it is actually within what they're trying to do that they need to build a tower of suppositions. They need to build one upon another upon another. Because again, what they're trying to do is to convince you of something, but what they're trying to convince you of is not something that is confirmable by demonstration through normal understanding and reason. If they had made that the basis of their story, then they're assuming that there is a human nature and that part of it is reason. And they can't do that. And so what they need to do is they need to use propaganda tools. They need to construct an argument that is a false argument and make it so convoluted so that you might be able to trace it backwards, but you'll never trace it backwards to the foundational idea in order to see that the foundational idea is actually not something confirmable and true. Because of course, if you're able to do that, then you're not going to accept the premises of their story itself. So they do need to build a tower of suppositions, so that where you are at the present moment is an arm's length away from where you actually started, so that you might actually be able to trace it backwards through a couple of suppositions, but you can't trace it all the way back. And this is their way of convincing people of their political ideology being true. They tell enough stories where it's the foundational basis, then people will begin in an instinctual way to believe that that basis of their story, which is their political ideology, is actually true and can be the basis of understanding human actions. So basically, they're telling a lie often enough and large enough in as many ways as possible so that eventually you accept that idea as being true, which again is what I defined as being propaganda. And I have examples of this from 2 major writers for DC and Marvel. They would be G. Willow Wilson and Kelly Sue DeConnick. Both of them came out in interviews saying that what they are doing is hoping to change the world, but they can't change the world directly. So what they have to do is change the minds of their readers in this progressive way, quite specifically in this progressive way. And when they change the minds of their readers to think in this progressive way, they will take those ideas, carry them into real life, and then those readers will then in turn change the world into this progressive utopia that they're looking for. So this is, by the words of some of these authors themselves, exactly what they are doing. But this again leads to a massive problem. One being that it is so difficult to understand what is going on in any of their comics, certainly if you haven't read them from the number 1 onwards. If you're trying to jump into the middle of a story, you're going to be completely lost. And I have experience of this because I do my 10-second comic reviews on this channel. They're over in the community section of this channel, just by the way, if you want to see them every week. And when I look at something that is a number 1, well, it's sort of easy to understand where they're coming from, even though it's garbage material. But if I jump into something that is in the middle of a story arc, that is, say, number 35 of a certain comic, I am completely lost. And of course I'm completely lost, because what's happening is I'm entering into the story upon one of their suppositions that has been built on this tower of other suppositions. And I don't know what those other suppositions are because I haven't read any of the previous issues. And so the thing is that if you don't read the storyline from the very beginning, you simply cannot understand the story by jumping into the middle of it, because it's just a tower of suppositions that you can't follow backward to a bedrock of understanding of what is going on in the story. And this is massively funny because you have these people from Marvel and DC, and they are lamenting over and over again that it is so hard to draw in an audience because it is so hard for these people to jump onto the stories and the characters. And they say this assuming that the hard part of it is that the there's so much history for these universes that people can't easily jump on. Now, I would say that is a little bit part of it, but really what is going on is people can't jump onto these stories because they're written in this progressive way, and this progressive way doesn't allow you to jump onto the middle of a story. It necessitates that if you want to understand it, not only do you have to have the same progressive mindset as the author, but you got to start from issue number 1 of the story arc and read every issue up until the point where you presently are. And if you miss number 1 or any of the issues in between, you're going to be lost because you can't follow the tower of suppositions that they're using to explain their story. And so this would explain the current condition of the comic industry. Because first of all, you have stories which are only meant for people who accept the same political ideology as the people writing the stories and controlling Marvel and DC. But even then, you can't engage those people very well because they all need to read the story from issue 1 of the story arc forward in order to understand what's going on. And I know very few people who are actually going to do that. So it's deuceably difficult for anybody to do it, even these progressive-minded people. And this is why I would say Marvel has changed everything into a miniseries, and there are so many number 1s coming out, being pushed out by them, because they understand, possibly just in the back of their mind, that you need to start from issue number 1 and go forward there, because if you don't, you're not going to understand what's going on in the story, and therefore, to generate any kind of audience whatsoever, they need to push out as many number 1s as possible and just flood the shelves with them with free issues and multiple covers so that you pick them up, so that you start with issue number 1 and therefore can understand, hopefully, the other 4, 5, 6 comics that are going to be in that story arc if you buy them all. And so my conclusion would be something that would be obvious to anyone except for these progressive-minded people. It's that if you disrespect the art of storytelling, you're going to get bad stories. Because that's what they're doing when they're trying to use this skeletal system of the storytelling, but impose upon it their political ideology. They're using the storytelling system for a means other than what the storytelling system is actually for. And in so disrespecting the art of storytelling, they're disrespecting something that has accompanied mankind since the beginning of written history, and in so doing, are disrespecting their audience before the story even begins. So, if I've given you anything new to think about, hit like, hit the shield in the lower right-hand corner of your screen to subscribe, and leave me a comment. Tell me what you think about all this. Alright, I'll see you later. Bye.